The Damascus incident, America's closest cowcaptor one, the cold open, September 18, 1980, in the hills and hollows of Van Buren County, Arkansas. The night was quiet in the way that rural America is quiet, completely, profoundly, and without apology. The crickets had settled into their autumn rhythm. The air carried the first faint coolness of an approaching fall, a reminder that summer was finally releasing its grip on the Ozark foothills. Farmers were thinking about harvests. Children had been back in school for 3 weeks. In the small towns nearby, Damascus, Guy, Greenbrier, families had eaten dinner, watched the evening news, and gone to bed with no particular reason to believe that Thursday would be anything other than an ordinary Thursday, 40 feet below a gravel access road, behind a security fence that most locals had learned to ignore. Something very different was underway. Missile combat crew members and maintenance technicians from the 308th Strategic Missile Wing, based at Little Rock Air Force Base, had been dispatched to launch Complex 374-7, a facility most people simply called the Silo. The assignment was routine, or as routine as anything could be when the object at the center of the work was one of the most destructive weapons ever assembled by human hands. The crew had been tasked with performing pressurization checks on the Stage 1 fuel oxidizer tank of the Titan to intercontinental ballistic missile housed 60 feet below the surface. This was, by the standards of nuclear weapons maintenance, an unremarkable job. Technicians performed these kinds of checks regularly. The Titan II had been in service since 1963, and by 1980 the procedures were well established, the protocols familiar, the checklists memorized. The men who worked on these missiles were trained professionals, serious about their responsibilities, and they had performed similar tasks dozens of times without incident. At approximately 6:30 in the evening, a 2-man team entered the silo itself to conduct their work. One of those men was a young airman who carried with him a non-standard socket, a large, heavy torque wrench socket that weighed approximately 3 pounds. The socket was an Air Force-1 socket, roughly the size of a man's fist. It was the kind of tool that, in a normal workplace, would be considered unremarkable. In the confined, pressurized environment of a Titan II silo, it was anything but. As the airmen worked on the upper level of the silo structure, somewhere around the 8th or 9th level depending on the account, the socket slipped. It fell freely through the open grating of the work platform and began its long, unobstructed descent through the interior of the silo. 80 feet. The socket tumbled 80 feet through the air before it struck the thrust mount of the missile far below. In terms of human experience, 80 feet is not a great distance. You can cover it in a few strides if you are walking quickly. But in the context of what it struck, 80 feet was more than enough. The socket hit the lower stage of the Titan II and punched through the thin metal skin of the missile's fuel tank. The puncture was small, a gash by most accounts of only about an inch in diameter, the kind of wound that would seem trivial if inflicted on almost any other object. But this was not any other object. The Titan II was fueled, as it always was, with hypergolic propellants, one of the most volatile and toxic chemical combinations ever engineered for human use. And now that combination was leaking within seconds of the socket's impact. A fine mist of Aerozine 50, the missile's fuel, began venting into the enclosed space of the silo. The hissing sound was faint at first, almost delicate, almost easy to dismiss as something minor. But the men inside the silo knew what that sound meant. They knew it the way firefighters know the sound of a structural groan, the way sailors know the sound of water rushing where it should not be. The evacuation order came quickly. The crew pulled back. The heavy blast door was sealed, and then began 9 hours that would push every safety protocol, every emergency procedure, and every human decision-making system that the United States Air Force possessed to its absolute limit. 9 hours that would end in an explosion that threw a 740-ton reinforced concrete blast door 600 feet into the night sky, and that would scatter the pieces of one of the most powerful nuclear weapons ever deployed in American territory across a pasture in the Arkansas countryside. This is the story of the Damascus Titan-to-missile incident. This is the story of the night the Cold War almost ended America before America could end anything else. Chapter 2. The Giant in the Earth. What was the Titan II? To understand the gravity of what happened in that silo in Van Buren County, Arkansas, you have to first understand what was living inside it. The Titan II was not simply a missile. It was a monument to a particular era of American ambition and American fear, an era when the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a technological competition so intense, so consuming, and so existentially consequential that both nations poured billions of dollars and the best scientific minds of a generation into the single project of building weapons capable of destroying each other entirely. The Titan II was one of the principal instruments of that project. At its most basic physical description, the Titan II was an intercontinental ballistic missile. It stood 103 feet tall and measured 10 feet in diameter. When fully fueled, it weighed approximately 330,000 pounds, about the same as a loaded Boeing 747 passenger jet. It carried a single W-53 thermonuclear warhead. That warhead had a yield of 9 megatons, for an audience that did not live through the nuclear testing era. And for many who did, the language of megatons can lose its meaning. Numbers like 9 megatons slide past the imagination without leaving much of a mark because there is no frame of ordinary reference large enough to hold them. So let us be specific about what 9 megatons means. The atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima, Japan, on August 6, 1945, had an explosive yield of approximately 15 kilotons. It killed somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 people instantly and ultimately contributed to the deaths of as many as 140,000 people by the end of 1945. It destroyed the center of a modern city. It remains one of the most destructive single acts in the history of human warfare. The W-53 warhead carried by the Titan II was 600 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. 600 times if you tried to represent that ratio physically. If you placed the Hiroshima bomb on one side of a scale and 600 copies of it on the other, you would begin to approach the destructive potential of the single warhead that rested at 6:30 in the evening on September 18, 1980, inside a silo in rural Arkansas while fuel leaked around its base. The Titan II was designed to deliver that warhead to a target anywhere in the Soviet Union from its buried silo in the American heartland. The missile's range exceeded 9,000 miles. After launch, it would climb through the atmosphere on a ballistic arc, reaching a peak altitude of several hundred miles before descending toward its designated target at speeds exceeding 15,000 miles per hour. From the moment of ignition to the moment of detonation over a Soviet city, the flight time would have been measured in minutes, 30 or fewer. Depending on the target, the silo itself was an engineering achievement of considerable scale. Launch Complex 374-7 consisted of a multi-story underground launch facility buried beneath a hardened reinforced concrete shell designed to withstand the overpressure of a nearby nuclear detonation. The complex was built in the early 1960s as part of a nationwide program to disperse America's nuclear forces and make them survivable in the event of a Soviet first strike. The logic was simple and terrible. If the enemy could destroy all of your weapons in a single surprise attack, they might be tempted to try. If your weapons were dispersed, hardened, and protected, the calculation changed. No first strike could be clean enough to prevent a devastating response. The silo at Damascus was one of 50 for Titan to launch complexes spread across the American landscape. Concentrated around 3 strategic Air Force bases, Little Rock in Arkansas, McConnell in Kansas, and Davis-Monthan in Arizona. Each complex was manned by a 2-person missile combat crew operating out of a hardened launch control center, connected to the silo by a long underground access tunnel. They worked 12-hour shifts, watching alert boards, running readiness checks, waiting for an order they hoped would never come. Each of these silos was, in a very real sense, a loaded gun pointed at the other side of the world. The missile was fueled, the warhead was armed in the sense that it was physically installed, and the crew stood ready at every hour of every day and night to receive the emergency action message that would begin the launch sequence. In 1980, those 54 Titan II missiles represented a substantial portion of American nuclear striking power. The 9-megaton warhead was among the largest yield weapons in the entire United States arsenal by this point. In fact, it was the largest single warhead deployed on any American land-based missile. The Titan II was a blunt instrument in the most literal sense. Rather than attempting to thread a needle with surgical precision, it was designed to deliver catastrophic destruction to an entire region. This was the weapon that was now leaking fuel in the Arkansas hills. This was what the Air Force needed to contain, to neutralize, and, if necessary, to somehow make safe, all while knowing that the chemicals now escaping into the silo complex were volatile enough to destroy the entire facility, and that the warhead at the top of the missile was sophisticated enough to present its own set of dangers that were entirely separate from any question of fuel chemistry. Understanding the Titan II means understanding that there was never a moment in the following 9 hours when the people managing this crisis were dealing with a single problem. They were dealing with several simultaneous catastrophes, any one of which could have spiraled into something far worse than what ultimately occurred. The fuel was one problem. The oxidizer was another. The warhead was a third. And underlying all of them was the fundamental question that haunted every decision made through the night of September 18th and into the early morning of September 19th. How do you make a nuclear weapon safe when the building it lives in is slowly filling with explosive vapor? Chapter 3. Mutual Assured Destruction and the Strategic Air Command. To understand why that missile was in that hole in the first place, you need to understand the world that put it there. By 1980, the Cold War was entering what many historians now recognize as its most dangerous and unstable phase. The period of détente that had characterized much of the 1970s, the arms control agreements, the diplomatic openings, the cautious optimism of SALT was unraveling. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December of 1979 had transformed the international atmosphere overnight. President Jimmy Carter had withdrawn the SALT treaty from Senate consideration. The United States Olympic boycott of the 1980 Moscow Games signaled just how thoroughly the relationship between the superpowers had deteriorated. Ronald Reagan, who was then in the final weeks of his presidential campaign against Carter, had been speaking forcefully about what he called the dangerous gap between American and Soviet military power, a gap he intended to close with a massive defense buildup. The world In the autumn of 1980 was not moving toward peace, the doctrine that had governed nuclear strategy since the mid-1950s was known as mutual assured destruction. The acronym MAD was not accidental, it captured something true about the underlying logic. The theory held that if both superpowers possessed enough nuclear weapons to destroy the other, and if both sides understood that any nuclear attack would guarantee a devastating nuclear response, neither side would ever initiate a nuclear exchange. The weapons themselves, by existing, would prevent their own use. Deterrence would be self-reinforcing. For this theory to function, several conditions had to be maintained simultaneously. Both sides needed to have a credible second strike capability, meaning that even if one side launched a devastating surprise first strike, the other side would retain enough surviving weapons to strike back and cause unacceptable damage. This requirement drove the development of the triad: land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and long-range strategic bombers. If the Soviets somehow found and destroyed all the American land-based missiles, the submarines would still be out there. If they destroyed the submarines, the bombers would still be airborne. The multiplicity of delivery systems made a truly disarming first strike theoretically impossible. The Strategic Air Command was the organization responsible for making this deterrent real. SAC was, by 1980, one of the most powerful military organizations in human history. It controlled all of America's land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles and all of its strategic bombers. It maintained the command and control networks that linked the president to the weapons. It trained, certified, and rotated the crews who stood alert in missile silos and bomber alert pads around the clock, every day of every year, ready to execute the single integrated operational plan, the SIOP, which was the master blueprint for American nuclear war-fighting. The men and women of SAC who worked in the missile fields understood their role with unusual clarity. They were not preparing for a war they expected to fight. They were preparing for a war whose very preparation was meant to ensure it never occurred. The alert status, the readiness, the permanent state of weapons hot vigilance, all of this was theater in the most serious possible sense of the word. It was a performance of capability and was aimed at an audience of Soviet generals and planners who needed to believe at every moment that any strike against the United States would be met with overwhelming and immediate nuclear retaliation. The 308th Strategic Missile Wing at Little Rock Air Force Base was an essential part of this performance. The wing's 18 Titan-to-launch complexes, spread across central Arkansas, represented a significant component of American nuclear deterrent power. Each of those complexes required constant maintenance, constant readiness checks, constant staffing. The missiles themselves, due to the nature of their propellants, required periodic inspection of their fuel and oxidizer tanks to ensure pressurization was maintained within specified limits. This was not optional work. Allowing a Titan II's fuel system to fall out of specified parameters could compromise the missile's ability to launch on order, and a missile that could not launch on order was not a deterrent. It was merely an expensive hole in the ground. This is the context in which the routine maintenance visit to Complex 374-7 was authorized. The pressurization check was necessary. The work had been done before. The protocols existed. The checklists were followed. And yet, within the immense complexity of maintaining these weapons, the chemical volatility of the propellants, the physical constraints of the silo environment, the human factors that inevitably accompany any task performed repeatedly over years, the margin between routine and catastrophe was, as September 18th would demonstrate, far thinner than anyone in the Air Force leadership wanted to acknowledge. SAC had a culture that was By design and by necessity, deeply risk-averse in matters of nuclear weapons. The permissive action links, the two-man rule, the strict procedural controls, all of these were genuine safeguards developed over years of hard-won experience and, occasionally, hard-learned lessons. But SAC's culture was also, in ways that the Damascus incident would reveal, sometimes more focused on maintaining the appearance of readiness than on confronting the structural vulnerabilities that existed in the actual physical systems under its care. The Titan II program, by 1980, was aging. The missiles had been in their silos for nearly 2 decades. The Air Force had already been in discussions about retiring the Titan II fleet and replacing its mission with more modern systems. The W-53 Warhead, for all its destructive power, was a product of 1960s technology, and the missile that carried it was showing the wear of years of continuous underground residence. The program's end was visible on the horizon, but in September of 1980 it had not yet arrived. The missiles were still on alert. The crews were still standing their shifts. And on the night of the 18th, maintenance technicians were still descending into the silos to perform their work. The Cold War logic that had placed those weapons in Arkansas had not changed. The deterrent mission had not changed. The only thing that had changed in an instant was the integrity of one fuel tank on one missile, and with it, everything that followed. Chapter 4. Hypergolic Nightmare. The science of the fuel. The word hypergolic is not a common word. It does not appear in ordinary conversation. Most people will go their entire lives without ever needing to understand what it means. But on the night of September 18, 1980, hypergolic chemistry was the central fact of the crisis unfolding beneath the Arkansas hills. And understanding it is essential to understanding why a small fuel leak in a missile silo could threaten not just the men inside it, but an entire region of the United States. Hypergolic propellants are, by definition, propellants that ignite spontaneously upon contact with each other. They do not require an ignition source, no spark, no flame, no detonator. When the fuel and the oxidizer meet, they react immediately and violently. This property made them enormously attractive to rocket engineers because it simplified the ignition process and made the propulsion system highly reliable. A rocket powered by hypergolic propellants would never fail to ignite because of a faulty spark plug or a delayed detonator. Contact equals combustion. The physics is unforgiving and absolute. The Titan II used to hypergolic propellants. The fuel was Aerozine 50, a 50-50 mixture of hydrazine and unsymmetrical dimethylhydrazine, commonly abbreviated UDMH. The oxidizer was nitrogen tetroxide, sometimes called NTO or N2O4, together. These two substances constituted one of the most energetically powerful and chemically hazardous propellant combinations ever used in an operational weapons system. Aerozine 50 is, in isolation, already an extraordinarily dangerous substance. It is a clear, slightly yellowish liquid with a faint fishy or ammonia-like odor that is detectable at concentrations as low as a few parts per million. It is acutely toxic, meaning that even brief exposure to relatively low concentrations can cause serious health effects. Inhalation of Aerozine 50 vapors causes a progressive cascade of physiological damage. At low concentrations, it produces irritation of the eyes, nose, and throat. At moderate concentrations, it causes nausea, dizziness, and neurological symptoms. At high concentrations, it attacks the central nervous system and can produce seizures, unconsciousness, and death. It is also a known carcinogen. What makes Aerozine 50 particularly treacherous in a silo environment is its volatility. It vaporizes readily at room temperature, meaning that a leak of liquid fuel quickly generates a cloud of toxic vapor that fills whatever enclosed space it occupies. The vapor is denser than air and tends to settle in low-lying areas, accumulating in concentrations that can reach dangerous levels far from the original leak site, nitrogen tetroxide. The oxidizer is in many ways even more immediately hazardous. It is a reddish-brown liquid with a sharp, acrid odor that converts readily to nitrogen dioxide gas upon vaporization. Nitrogen dioxide is one of the most toxic gases used in industrial or military applications. It attacks the respiratory system aggressively, causing chemical burns to the tissues of the lungs, and its effects can be delayed. A person who seems to recover from initial nitrogen dioxide exposure may develop fatal pulmonary edema hours later, when fluid accumulation in the lung tissue reaches a critical point. This delayed toxicity made nitrogen tetroxide exposure particularly insidious, because victims might not realize the severity of their injury until it was too late to treat effectively, but the combined danger of these two substances extends far beyond their individual toxicities. When Aerozine 50 and nitrogen tetroxide vapors mix in sufficient concentrations, they form an explosive mixture. The fuel vapor, once it reaches its lower explosive limit in air, approximately 2.5% by volume, becomes capable of detonating in a flash fire or explosion if it encounters either an ignition source or a sufficient concentration of oxidizer. This is not a theoretical danger. It is a documented physical reality that every person who worked on Titan II systems understood with complete clarity. The silo at complex 374-7 was, after the socket's impact, filling with Aerozine 50 vapor. The leak from the punctured fuel tank was continuing, and although the Air Force had instrumentation that could monitor vapor concentrations at various points in the silo, the readings were climbing steadily. The confined space of the silo acted like a collection vessel, concentrating the vapor rather than dispersing it. And because the nitrogen tetroxide oxidizer was stored in the same environment, in its own separate but adjacent tank, the possibility of a hypergolic combustion event was not a remote or theoretical concern. It was a continuously approaching reality. There was a further dimension to the fuel chemistry problem that made the situation at Damascus particularly acute, and that was the nature of the fuel fire hazard in relation to the warhead. The W-53 warhead at the top of the Titan II was a thermonuclear device, a hydrogen bomb. Like all thermonuclear weapons of this era, it required a fission trigger, a conventional nuclear device, to initiate the fusion reaction that produced the bulk of its energy. That fission trigger contained conventional high explosives, specifically designed explosive lenses that had to detonate in precise sequence to create the implosion necessary to initiate a nuclear chain reaction. The high explosives in the warhead were engineered to be extremely resistant to accidental detonation. This was one of the primary safety design goals of the warhead program, but they were not infinitely resistant. A sufficiently violent mechanical shock or an intense fire of sufficient duration and temperature could potentially compromise the safety systems and cause an unintended detonation of the conventional explosives. If that happened, the result would not necessarily be a nuclear detonation. The probability of an accidental nuclear yield from this scenario was considered very low, though not zero. But even a conventional detonation of the warhead's explosive lenses would have scattered radioactive material across a wide area, creating a radiological contamination event of serious consequence. This was the layered nightmare that confronted Air Force commanders on the night of September 18th. They were not managing a single emergency. They were managing a chemical emergency, a fire and explosion hazard, a toxic industrial accident, and a nuclear weapons safety situation simultaneously, all in a confined underground space. In the middle of the night, in rural Arkansas, and the fuel was still leaking. Chapter 5: The 9-hour standoff. 9 hours between the initial fuel leak and the explosion that ended the crisis were not 9 hours of paralysis. They were 9 hours of sustained, increasingly desperate effort by the men of the 308th Strategic Missile Wing and their commanders at Little Rock Air Force Base. Effort that was complicated at every turn by the nature of the environment they were working in, the limits of the equipment available to them, and the escalating physical danger of re-entering a silo that was becoming, moment by moment, more lethal. The first response was evacuation. Within minutes of the socket's impact at approximately 6:30 in the evening, the crew inside the silo had withdrawn and the blast door had been sealed. This was the right move and the only defensible move. Putting people inside a filling cloud of Aerozine 50 vapor without proper protective equipment would have been immediately fatal. The crew assembled in the Launch Control Center and began reporting to their chain of command. The Missile Combat Crew Commander, Senior Airman David Livingston, and his team began assessing the situation. Vapor concentration monitors built into the silo were transmitting data, and what those monitors were showing was not encouraging. The Aerozine 50 vapor levels inside the silo were rising. The question facing the crew and their commanders was whether re-entry was possible, and if so, what could be done once someone was back inside. Commanders at Little Rock Air Force Base were notified within the first hour. The base's Emergency Management Office began assembling a response team. The complexity of the situation quickly became apparent. This was not a scenario for which the standard emergency procedures provided a clean or obvious solution. The Titanese fuel system was not designed with easy external shutoff capability. The propellants were contained in pressurized tanks integral to the missile structure, and the only way to stop the leak was to enter the silo and physically address it. That meant putting men in pressure suits specifically. The Air Force Rocket Propellant Handler Suits, abbreviated RFHCO suits, that were standard equipment for working with Titan to propellants. These suits provided protection against liquid and vapor contact, but they were not designed for extended operations. They limited mobility considerably, and they required to man buddy teams for any entry, one person to perform the work, one to maintain observation and be prepared to assist with extraction. The problem was vapor concentration. To safely enter the silo using RFHCO protective equipment, the vapor levels had to be within certain bounds. If the concentration was too high, the suit's protection margin was insufficient. If the concentration had reached the lower explosive limit for Aerozine 50, any spark from any source, including the electrical systems of the RFHCO suit itself, could trigger a detonation. Throughout the evening and into the night, multiple entry attempts were made and aborted. Teams suiting up, reviewing procedures, preparing to enter, only to be turned back by vapor readings that exceeded safe entry limits, or by equipment problems, or by the developing understanding that the situation inside was worse than the previous assessment had indicated. At approximately 11 p.m., a team did successfully re-enter the silo. The conditions inside were already severe. The Aerozine 50 vapor was visible as a faint haze in the confined space, and the smell, even through the suit's filtration, was detectable. The team moved to assess the damage and evaluate what options existed for stopping or slowing the leak. What they found was not encouraging. The puncture in the fuel tank was continuing to vent fuel, and the rate of vaporization appeared to be increasing as the tank pressure drove more liquid through the breach. The team withdrew. Another assessment. Another consultation with commanders. Another set of calculations about vapor, concentrations and explosive limits and the feasibility of intervention. It is worth pausing at this point to consider the human dimension of what was happening at Launch Complex 374-7 during these hours. The men making these repeated entry attempts were not doing so at gunpoint or under orders that gave them no choice. They understood the danger with professional clarity. They were making a calculated decision each time that the mission, securing the warhead containing the chemical hazard, preventing a worse outcome, justified the risk they were accepting. That is not a small thing. The culture of the Strategic Air Command demanded a great deal of its people, and on this night, those demands were being met in full by 2 a.m. on September 19th. The situation had been deteriorating for nearly 8 hours. The vapor concentration inside the silo had reached levels that made further manned intervention essentially impossible without accepting near certain casualties. The leak had been ongoing for hours, and estimates of the total amount of Aerozine 50 that had escaped into the silo environment were measured in thousands of gallons. The silo was, by this point, filled with a toxic and explosive atmosphere. The decision-making process at this stage reflects the genuine difficulty of the situation. There were arguments for attempting one more intervention, the warhead recovery concern, the potential for the situation to escalate further, the professional imperative to attempt to preserve the weapons system. There were arguments against the vapor levels, the risk to personnel, the recognition that the situation might have already passed the point where manned intervention could change the outcome. At some point in the early morning hours of September 19th, a command decision was made that reflected this calculus. A team would make one more entry attempt, with the goal of improving the situation enough to allow for a controlled resolution. That attempt was underway. Personnel were either in the silo or preparing to re-enter when the situation resolved itself in the most violent way possible. Chapter 6 hours 3 minutes and 1 second a.m. The explosion at 3:01 in the morning on September 19, 1980. The Aerozine 50 vapor inside the silo at Launch Complex 374-7 reached its explosive limit. The detonation was not a nuclear explosion. It is important to state this clearly and at the outset because what happened at 3:01 a.m. was catastrophic enough on its own terms without the additional catastrophe that did not occur. The explosion that tore through the silo was a chemical detonation, the ignition of the accumulated Aerozine 50 vapor, reacting with the nitrogen tetroxide oxidizer and the oxygen in the enclosed space. In a single, enormous combustion event, the force released by that combustion was immense. The silo at Launch Complex 374-7 was topped by a blast door, a reinforced concrete and steel structure designed to protect the missile from the effects of a near-miss nuclear detonation. This was not an ordinary door. It was a circular disc of hardened construction weighing approximately 740 tons. 740 tons. The equivalent of roughly 500 full-sized automobiles. Welded together into a single disc and placed over the opening of the silo as a protective cap, the explosion threw that door 600 feet into the air. 600 feet is higher than the Washington Monument. It is higher than the Space Needle in Seattle. The 740-ton blast door was propelled upward by the force of the chemical detonation to a height greater than any structure in most American cities, and then it came down and landed several hundred feet from the silo opening. The crater that resulted from both the explosion and the impact of the door was enormous. The Titan II missile itself was destroyed. The explosive force that the propellant combination produced was sufficient to tear the missile apart, fragmenting the airframe and the engine components and scattering them across the site. Pieces of the Titan II were found over a wide area around the launch complex and the warhead. The W-53 warhead, all 9 megatons of it, was thrown clear of the silo by the force of the explosion. It flew through the night air and came to rest, impact point and all, in a field approximately 100 feet from the silo complex. The warhead safety systems, the mechanical safing mechanisms, the environmental sensing devices designed to prevent arming under conditions other than a controlled launch sequence performed exactly as designed. There was no nuclear detonation. There was no nuclear yield, not even a partial one. The warhead landed in the dirt of an Arkansas pasture and sat there, intact, one of the most powerful nuclear weapons ever built. Waiting to be found, the explosion threw personnel who were near the silo opening at the time of the detonation. Multiple airmen were injured. Some were blown from the blast area by the initial overpressure wave. The conditions in the immediate aftermath of the explosion were chaotic: smoke, toxic vapor, darkness, personnel down. Disorientation from the shock of the blast itself. Emergency response personnel from Little Rock Air Force Base were already at or near the site when the explosion occurred, and they moved immediately to address the casualties and secure the area. The priority after the initial rescue of injured personnel was to locate and secure the warhead, a task that was accomplished relatively quickly given that the warhead had not traveled far from the silo itself. The physical evidence left behind by the explosion was extraordinary in its scale. The silo complex, a structure built to survive a near-miss nuclear detonation, had been destroyed from the inside by the very substance meant to power its weapon. The crater was deep and wide. The debris field was extensive. And at the center of it all, where the Titan had stood for 17 years, there was now simply an open wound in the Arkansas landscape. Chapter 7: The Aftermath and the Fallen. The hours and days following the explosion. The work of accounting and recovery began. The warhead was located and secured. In the early morning hours of September 19th, a nuclear weapons recovery team, personnel specifically, trained for the retrieval of nuclear weapons that have been involved in accidents, what the military calls a broken arrow event, took custody of the W-53. Physical examination of the warhead indicated that its safety systems had functioned correctly. The conventional high explosives had not detonated. The fission trigger was intact. The warhead was transportable and was removed from the site for detailed technical evaluation. The official broken arrow designation attached to the Damascus incident placed it in a category of nuclear weapons accidents that the Air Force tracked with the utmost seriousness. There had been other broken arrow events in American military history, accidents involving aircraft carrying nuclear weapons, mishaps during handling and transport, but the Damascus incident was distinctive in several respects. It was the first time in the history of the Titan program that a fueled missile had been destroyed in its silo, and it was, by any reasonable measure, among the closest calls the United States had experienced in its entire nuclear weapons program. The toll in human terms was significant. 23 people were injured in the incident, a number that includes both personnel injured in the explosion itself and personnel who suffered toxic exposure during the 9 hours of the standoff. The injuries ranged from blast trauma to chemical burns to respiratory damage from propellant vapor inhalation, and there was one man who did not survive. Senior Airman David Livingston was 21 years old. He was assigned to the 308th Strategic Missile Wing and had been part of the response effort throughout the long night of September 18th and into the early morning of the 19th, in the moments surrounding the explosion, Livingston was in the vicinity of the silo complex. He was thrown by the blast and suffered severe injuries. Livingston was transported to a medical facility and received treatment, but his injuries were ultimately not survivable. He died as a result of the explosion and its associated trauma. He was, in the fullest sense, a casualty of the Cold War, a young American who died not in combat, not on a battlefield overseas, but in a field in Arkansas, in service of the deterrent mission that he and thousands of others like him had accepted as their professional duty. David Livingston was awarded the Purple Heart posthumously. His death was acknowledged in the official Air Force investigation and in the subsequent public accounts of the incident. But for many years, the full story of what happened at Damascus was not widely known outside of Air Force and defense circles. The incident received some news coverage at the time, but the combination of classification, geographic isolation, and the general public preference for not thinking too deeply about what was buried beneath the American countryside meant that the Damascus incident did not enter the mainstream American consciousness in the way it perhaps deserved. In the years following the incident, some of the men who had been present that night, crew members, maintenance technicians, emergency responders, began to speak more openly about what they had experienced. Their accounts, gathered by journalists, historians, and documentary filmmakers in the decades since, form the most vivid and complete record of the human experience of that night. They describe the smell of the fuel, the heat of the suits, the frustration of failed entry attempts, the terror of the explosion, and the strange, disoriented relief of having survived something that, at many points during those 9 hours, had seemed entirely capable of killing everyone present. The physical site of Launch Complex 374-7 was sealed and the cleanup was conducted over the following weeks. The debris was cleared. The silo was eventually decommissioned and the site was remediated, though the chemical contamination from the fuel and oxidizer spill required extensive environmental treatment. Today, the site is on private land, and the physical evidence of what happened there on the night of September 18, 1980, has largely been reclaimed by the Arkansas landscape. Chapter 8. The Projection. What if it had detonated? It is a question that the mind finds difficult to hold without recoiling. But it must be asked and it must be answered honestly, because the honest answer is the most powerful argument for the significance of the Damascus incident and for the urgency of understanding it clearly. What would have happened if the W-53 warhead had detonated? The premise requires careful framing. As discussed, the safety systems on the W-53 were well designed and performed correctly. There was not, in any high-probability sense, a risk of nuclear detonation from the explosion that destroyed the silo. The more realistic catastrophic scenario was not the warhead detonating in the field where it landed, but rather a scenario in which the conventional explosives in the warhead were triggered by the blast or by a subsequent fire, creating a radiological dispersal event rather than a nuclear one. Still more serious, but in the realm of the theoretically possible, would have been a scenario in which a combination of explosive force and subsequent fire caused what nuclear weapons engineers call a partial yield, a low-order nuclear detonation that does not achieve the weapon's designed yield but nonetheless produces a nuclear explosion. Both of these scenarios were considered by Air Force planners in the immediate aftermath and in the subsequent formal investigation, but let us examine the full detonation scenario, the question of what a full 9-megaton detonation at surface level in Van Buren County, Arkansas, would have produced. We do this not to sensationalize, but because the data is real, the physics is documented, and the scale of what was avoided deserves to be stated in explicit terms. A 9-megaton surface burst in rural Arkansas would have produced an immediate fireball approximately 2 miles in diameter. Within that fireball, everything, soil, rock, vegetation, any structure, would have been instantly vaporized. The crater produced by a surface detonation of this magnitude would have been roughly a mile across and several hundred feet deep. Beyond the fireball, the blast wave would have radiated outward at supersonic speed, at a distance of approximately 5 miles from the detonation point. The overpressure from the blast wave would have been sufficient to destroy virtually all residential construction, the kind of wood frame houses that make up the majority of rural Arkansas's housing stock. Complete destruction of all ordinary structures would have extended to roughly a 5-mile radius. Serious structural damage enough to cause widespread collapse and casualties would have extended to approximately 10 miles. The thermal pulse from a 9-megaton detonation is difficult to describe in ordinary terms. Third-degree burns, full thickness. Burns that destroy all layers of skin and the underlying tissue would have been inflicted on exposed individuals at distances of up to approximately 15 miles from the detonation point on a clear day. This is not a minor effect. Third-degree burns across a significant percentage of the body's surface are typically fatal without immediate and extensive medical care. At 15 miles from Damascus, on a clear September night, an unprotected person outdoors would have received lethal burns. Now consider the geography. Damascus, Arkansas, sits in the Ozark foothills of Van Buren County, -170 miles north of Little Rock. The city of Little Rock, with its 1980 population of approximately 160,000 people, would have been within the severe blast damage radius of a detonation at Damascus. The Arkansas River Valley, home to additional hundreds of thousands of people across central Arkansas, would have been in the zone of devastating effects, but the blast effects, as terrible as they are not the only dimension of the problem. They are not even the most geographically extensive dimension. The fallout from a surface or near-surface nuclear detonation, the radioactive material sucked up into the mushroom cloud and then distributed by wind across a wide area, is in many ways the most dangerous and far-reaching effect of a nuclear explosion. For a 9-megaton surface burst, the fallout pattern would have depended heavily on wind direction and speed. The prevailing winds in central Arkansas during September typically have a southerly or westerly component at various altitudes, which would have carried fallout toward the northeast and east in the direction of the Mississippi River Valley and beyond. Memphis, Tennessee, lies approximately 130 miles to the northeast of Damascus. Nashville, Tennessee, lies approximately 330 miles to the northeast. Under conditions of moderate southwesterly wind, fallout from a Damascus detonation could have reached both cities within hours of the explosion. Fallout at lethal or near-lethal doses does not require proximity to the blast. People miles from any visible evidence of the explosion, people who heard nothing and saw nothing, could have received lethal doses of radiation from fallout deposited on the ground around them and breathed into their lungs. The population center of Memphis in 1980 was approximately 650,000 people. The metropolitan area of Nashville was approximately 800,000. The fallout dose rate at these distances would have depended on specific meteorological conditions, but under plausible wind scenarios, areas of both cities could have received radiation doses in the range of hundreds of rem in the first 24 hours following the detonation, doses that produce acute radiation syndrome and At the higher end, death within days to weeks, the agricultural dimension would have been severe and long-lasting. Arkansas was, in 1980, one of the most productive agricultural states in the nation: rice, soybeans, cotton, cattle. Fallout contamination of soil and water across the Arkansas River Valley and into neighboring states would have rendered vast agricultural areas unusable for years, depending on the specific isotopic composition of the fallout. The Mississippi River watershed, into which much of Arkansas drains, would have been a vector for radioactive contamination of a scale and duration that staggers the imagination. The total casualty figure from a scenario of this kind, immediate deaths from blast, fire, and prompt radiation, plus deaths from fallout in the weeks and months following, would have run into the hundreds of thousands at minimum, and potentially into the millions if the full fallout exposure path was as adverse as some scenarios suggest. None of this happened. The safety systems worked. The Warhead did not detonate. David Livingston is the one name on the ledger of the dead, not hundreds of thousands of unnamed Americans across the Mid-South, but it came close enough that we owe it the full weight of its significance. Chapter 9, The Final Reflection, the margin of error. In the months following the Damascus incident, the Air Force conducted a formal investigation. The findings were, in some respects, unsurprising. The immediate cause of the accident was identified as the non-standard socket that had been brought into the silo and subsequently dropped. Procedural lapses in the conduct of the maintenance operation were identified. Recommendations were made for improved procedural controls and for enhanced training requirements for personnel working in Titan II facilities, but the investigation also confirmed something that those closest to the Titan II program had known for years, even if the knowledge had sometimes been uncomfortable to acknowledge openly. The Titan II system was old. Its propellants were extraordinarily hazardous, and the margin between a successful maintenance operation and a catastrophic one had always been significantly narrower than the public statements about the program's safety record had implied. The Damascus incident was not, in fact, the first serious accident involving a Titan II and its propellants. There had been fuel leaks before, in Arkansas and at other Titan II bases. There had been injuries from propellant exposure. There had been near misses and close calls that had been managed quietly and had not made the front pages. The Titan II program had accumulated a safety record that, examined in full rather than in the carefully curated versions sometimes presented to congressional committees and the public, reflected the genuine dangers of maintaining liquid-fueled ballistic missiles on continuous alert over multi-decade periods. The Damascus incident brought this reality into the open in a way that could not be easily managed or minimized. A silo had been destroyed. A warhead had been thrown across a field. A man had died. The Air Force could not credibly claim that this was a minor anomaly in an otherwise pristine safety record. The Titan II decommissioning program, which had already been in the planning stages before Damascus, accelerated. The Reagan administration, which had just taken office in January of 1981, inherited a nuclear weapons modernization program that included the retirement of the Titan II fleet. The decommissioning proceeded through the early 1980s, with the last Titan II missile taken off alert status in 1984, and the final deactivation of the Titan II program completed in 1987. The mission was taken over by Minuteman III missiles and by the Peacekeeper, both of which used solid fuel propellants that were dramatically safer and less hazardous than the Aerozine 50 and nitrogen tetroxide combination that had brought the Damascus incident to its explosive conclusion. The W-53 warheads removed from the decommissioned Titan II missiles were themselves retired from the arsenal over the following years. The specific warhead recovered from the Arkansas's pasture on the morning of September 19, 1980, was evaluated, found to be intact and serviceable, and entered into the normal warhead management process. Its ultimate disposition, like that of most retired nuclear weapons, is not a matter of public record. The site of Launch Complex 374-7 was cleaned up, decommissioned, and eventually returned to something resembling its prior state. The silo was demolished and the underground complex was sealed. The concrete and steel and excavated earth that had once housed one of the most powerful weapons in history was covered over, and the Arkansas's landscape began its slow process of reclamation. What does the Damascus incident mean more than 40 years later? It means, first and most directly, that the safety systems built into American nuclear weapons in the 1970s and 1980s worked. The W-53's safety mechanisms, the devices specifically engineered to prevent accidental nuclear detonation, performed exactly as designed under conditions of extreme mechanical stress. This is not nothing. It represents the outcome of genuine engineering effort, genuine investment in the problem of preventing accidental nuclear use, and genuine technical competence on the part of the people who designed these systems. The Damascus incident in this reading is a story of safety systems working, but it also means something else, something more uncomfortable and more important. It means that the safety margin on which the United States, and indeed all of civilization, depended during the Cold War was, at least in some cases, considerably narrower than the official record suggested. The Damascus incident was a dropped socket, a 3-pound piece of metal falling 80 feet. That is all it took to initiate a 9-hour crisis that destroyed a nuclear missile, killed an airman, injured 23 others, and came close enough to a warhead detonation scenario that the possibility had to be seriously and formally evaluated by the United States Air Force. The history of nuclear weapons programs, examined honestly, is in significant part a history of close calls. Damascus is one of the most dramatic of those close calls, but it is not the only one. There have been aircraft accidents, storage accidents, transportation incidents, command and control failures, and near misses and early warning systems that, on various occasions and to varying degrees, brought the world closer to nuclear disaster than the official narrative of careful stewardship and robust safety systems would suggest. This does not mean that the people managing these weapons were negligent or careless. Many of them were, as the airmen of the 308th Strategic Missile Wing demonstrated, extraordinarily dedicated and professionally courageous. It means that the systems are complex, the materials are dangerous, the environments are unforgiving, and humans make mistakes. David Livingston was 21 years old when he died in an Arkansas field in the service of the mission of nuclear deterrence. He was doing his job. He was following the protocols and training he had been given. He was, in every meaningful sense, doing what the United States of America had asked him to do. And the gap between his death and a vastly larger catastrophe was measured, in the end, in the reliability of safety mechanisms that most people had never heard of and that, in the ordinary course of events, were never meant to be tested under conditions like those that prevailed at 3:01 in the morning on September 19, 1980. The Cold War ended 9 years after the Damascus incident, without a nuclear exchange. The Soviet Union dissolved. The arsenals were reduced, if not eliminated. The Titan II missiles that once sat beneath the American heartland were pulled from their silos, their fuel drained, their warheads removed. Some of the silos were demolished. One of them, in Arizona, was converted into a museum where visitors can descend into the underground complex and stand beside an inert Titan II missile and try to comprehend what it once represented, but The weapons themselves did not disappear. The United States retains a nuclear arsenal of considerable size. Russia retains one as well. Other nations have built their own. The problem of accidental or unauthorized nuclear use, the problem that the Damascus incident represents in its most concentrated form, has not been solved by the end of the Cold War. It has evolved, shifted in its specific contours, but it persists. Somewhere in the world, at this very moment, there are nuclear weapons on some form of alert status, maintained by human beings who are capable of making mistakes, housed in systems that are capable of failing. In a world where the gap between a routine maintenance operation and a catastrophe of unimaginable scale can be measured in the distance of an 80-foot fall, the Damascus incident did not change the world. It did not end the Cold War. It did not transform nuclear policy or produce a fundamental reassessment of the risks that nations accept when they choose to build and maintain nuclear weapons. It was, in the accounting of the Cold War, a small event, 1 dead, 23 injured, 1 silo destroyed, 1 warhead recovered. By the standards of what the Cold War was capable of producing, it was almost trivial, and that, perhaps, is the most unsettling thing about it. The Damascus incident was a small event that was approximately 1 layer of safety system reliability away from being one of the largest catastrophes in American history. The distance between those two outcomes, the small event and the catastrophe, was not filled with careful planning or brilliant decision-making or institutional wisdom. It was filled with the correct functioning of engineering systems that the people in the field that night had no ability to control or influence. Once the explosion had occurred, we were lucky. On the night of September 18, 1980, in the hills of Van Buren County, Arkansas, the United States was lucky. That is not a reassuring conclusion. It is an honest one. The men of the 308th Strategic Missile Wing went to work that evening expecting a routine night. They ended it carrying casualties from a destroyed silo, standing guard over a nuclear warhead lying in a pasture, waiting for dawn in the aftermath of an explosion that had tested every system and every protocol the Air Force possessed. They had done their jobs. They had been as capable and as courageous as their training had made them, and they had been, in the end, dependent on the correct performance of safety mechanisms that they had played no part in designing and could not, in the moments that mattered most, do anything to influence. This is the margin of error on which the fate of cities rests. This is the margin of error on which it has always rested, from the first deployment of nuclear weapons in the continental United States to the present day. It is narrower than we like to think. It is wider than it was on the night of September 18, 1980, and it deserves more than almost any other fact about the nuclear era to be remembered with complete clarity and complete seriousness by everyone who was alive during the Cold War, and by everyone who has inherited its consequences. David Livingston, 21 years old. Van Buren County, Arkansas, September 19, 1980. Remember his name, and remember what it almost cost the rest of us.